Publishing's YouTube channel. So today we're going to be talking about typesetting or InDesign, which basically focuses on the interior design of the book. We're going to be focusing on the different aspects or the specifications within the designing of the interior of the book, right? And I feel that most self-published authors are not aware and they don't see or realize the significance of actually designing the interior of your book. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing that we need to be aware of, or rather decide on, is what is it that we're going to use for the designing of the interior of the book, right? Now there are two options. One is to use Microsoft Word, and the other option is to use a software like Adobe InDesign. Now I've used Microsoft Word before and the client was quite pleased. The name of the book is Your Transformation Summons by Matsepo Seoka. And I designed the book, yes, the interior of it. It did take me some time, especially because it was not my first time, but it was, I would say maybe my third time working on a manuscript or working on the designing of the interior of the book, and the client was quite pleased. And it did take me some time, like I said, especially because I was not as experienced using Microsoft Word. But one thing that I've found limiting though is there are some creativity and symbols that Microsoft Word would not have, which Adobe InDesign, for instance, would have. And that also depends on the type of book that you are publishing. Does it require that intense or fancy InDesign, or is it just a book that you would be okay with just using a simple design? But at the end of the day, making sure that the interior of the book is presentable. Right, so now I will cover 8 specifications that you need to be aware of, you need to decide on when designing your book, right? The first one is the trim size of your book, the final size of your book. Because obviously with the manuscript, it comes in as an A4 or an A5, depending on the author, but preferably it would come in as an A4. And therefore, obviously, we will not print an A4 size book. Non-fiction books or cookbooks or children's books, not necessarily, because they have their specific trim sizes, right? There are trim sizes for non-fiction. It's 5 by 8 inches, 5.5 by 8.5 inches. For cookbooks, it's 8.5 by 11 inches. For children's books, there's 7.5 by 7.5 inches. There's 7 by 10 inches as well. So for each different genre or each different type of book, there is a specific trim size that we need to decide on. And it really depends on the experience of the person that has been working with books, because from the number of pages and from the number of words it actually has, we would then be able to tell, okay, which is the perfect trim size for this book, because what we have in mind is the end product. What we have in mind is, the thickness of the book, how it will look like in the end, and whether it will look professional. So because we have that picture, you can then tell from the number of pages and number of words which is then going to be the perfect trim size, right? The other specification that you need to look into is the margins, right? So the top and the bottom, left and right margins need to be determined, as well as the header, right? And it's so significant in that the way the book is presented, it needs to be easy for the reader to follow. If you think about a book that has, very thin margins, can you picture how that book looks like? Can you just picture if the paragraphs seem congested and there seems to be so much clutter and there's no order? So that is the reason why we have margins, is to make the page look presentable, so that the layout is compelling and enticing, the reader to continue to read on. I feel that readers would also appreciate the time and effort put into making sure that the book is presentable. It's also a way for them to see that, okay, it was actually worth buying this book because they can see that time and effort was put into, the presentation of the interior of the book. Alright, so now we look into the third specification to consider, which is the word count. Now, word count looks into the number of words that you would have on each page of the book. Of the book as in not the manuscript, but the trim size of the book. So the page of an already sized book according to the trim size that was determined at the beginning, right? Now, it's very important to determine the number of words per page. You don't want to have too many words that the page would look so intimidating for the reader. At the same time, you don't want too little words, and the spacing as well between the words is very important, but that's something that I will cover later on. So you need to determine the number of words per page, and it would be determined based on the number of words and pages the manuscript actually has already, because like I said, we look into the end product, how it will look like, and if we know what is the best size based on the number of words and number of pages the manuscript has, then we would also have an idea of how many words then each page should have. The fourth specification that we can look into is the font type. Now, with the font type, it's very important to determine which font type you will use because it affects the reading experience of the reader, and it is determined by the type of book that it is and what you're trying to achieve. So, for instance, children's books, they have their specific font types that need to be used. A business book, you would have, there would be an expectation of the type of font that you would use for a business book, because for a business book you wouldn't use the same font that you would use on a children's book for a business book. That wouldn't make any sense. So the type of font that you use, it must relate and it must match the type of book that you are publishing and whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. So it would be a good idea for you to look into the genres that you want to publish, to look into the type of fonts that are used there, and maybe you might not necessarily find them on the Microsoft Word, but at least you would know more or less the type of font that you must use for whatever book that you're trying to publish. But of course, there are graphic designers, there are typesetters, and we have some typesetters as well that can assist, who have the experience and they know which fonts to use. The fifth specification that you can look into is the font color. Now, I know font color, it's quite obvious that black would be the font color that you would use, right? But for a children's book, for instance, it may be different, because I know that for a children's book, there are those that would have a specific graphic design with words being in color, especially for the book cover design. And that book cover design would then be, copied onto the first page of the book. So obviously the color would then not necessarily be black, but it would be a different color. But it also depends, on the creativity. But generally speaking, a black font color is the general font color that is used for all books. Of course, there will be those exceptions of children's books, or perhaps maybe a cookbook, just depending on the creativity that is used on whatever book that you are working on. Now, the sixth specification to look into is the font size. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, we would determine the best trim size for the book depending on the number of pages and number of words, right? But then now the font size also affects the thickness. It will affect the final product of the book, how it would look like in the end, how thick it would be, and therefore you need to determine what the base one would be. While at the same time, we don't want the font size to be too small. Again, it depends on the type of genre that you are publishing. For children's books, a font can be fairly big, but also it just depends on the age group that you're looking into, because there are those age groups that don't need too much information. They can't take in a lot of information or a lot of words. So in that case, obviously there will be only a few words and the font can be fairly big. But for a non-fiction book or a cookbook, which would be for adults, the font has to be, fairly small, but not too small that a person would want to squint, right? It also depends on your target market. If your target market is also the elderly, who have eyesight problems, you need to look into that as well. But also at the same time, making sure that the font is not too big, because at the same time, it needs to look professional. But you need to keep in mind that the font does affect the thickness of your book. And again, the main focus is to make sure that the book looks presentable and it entices the reader to read each and every single page. So you don't want to scare the reader with a bigger font that looks too big. You don't want to scare the reader away by having a font that is too small as well, that they feel that they don't want to read any more of this book because they've been squinting so much. Now, the second last specification to look into, I'll combine with another one as well. It's indentation and line spacing, because they both focus on the words and how the words are presented. Now, indentation, usually it's implemented for when each paragraph starts. So where you want to make a division and to show that there's a new paragraph that is starting, then you would have indentation. And it's basically shifting the sentence a little bit to the right compared to all the other lines below it. And then with line spacing as well affects the presentation of the words in general. And with line spacing, we want to make sure that the words are not too close to each other, not congested, not too clustered. So line spacing has that effect. But the other thing that we need to focus on as well is to make sure that there aren't those big spaces in between words, because sometimes there will be big spaces and some small spaces in between the words, so you see that there's no consistency, and you need to make sure that that is sorted out. But with Adobe InDesign software, for instance, that can be fixed. The last thing is the extent, which is the number of pages. Now, the exact number of pages will obviously be known once everything has been implemented as designed, right? Now, it's important for us to understand that when we are deciding on the specifications, it's all for the purpose of making sure that the book looks presentable. We keep in mind the end product, and we keep in mind, the presentation for the reader, to make sure that the book is enticing and that the layout is compelling to the extent that the reader would be pleased with the presentation and therefore be enticed to actually continue to read your book. Now, there is still more. There is still more once all of the designing has been implemented now in the manuscript. There are 5 more things that you need to keep in mind or need to implement. Now, the first thing is called Cunning. Now, Cunning deals with the spaces in between the letters, because there will be some instances where you would have spaces in between letters, but they're not supposed to be there, right? So with typesetting, with typesetters, they check on that and they fix that, right? The second thing is called Orphans and Widows. Now, widows would be like a sentence or a line of a paragraph that appears on a page and the rest of the page is blank, and then the next page is the next chapter. So to avoid that, there will be something that will be done to then make sure that paragraph actually goes back to be with the rest of the text, instead of having this one line on this one blank page. Orphans would then be an opening paragraph or opening line of a paragraph, which would be at the end of a previous page, whereas the rest of the paragraph is on the next page. So instead, you'd rather just have that opening line to be on the same page as the rest of the paragraph that it belongs to. So typesetters, they also fix that, or that's rather something that you must also keep in mind or check after you have implemented the specifications as per the design. The fourth thing to look into is drop caps. It's more of a styling type of thing, where the first letter of a chapter, for instance, would be styled in such a way that it takes up 3 lines or 2 lines, however many lines that you would like, but it will essentially be the first letter of a chapter, which would show or indicate that there is a new chapter that's starting, and it would just be different from the rest of the letters. And the last thing to consider is book blocks, and the whole point of this is to make sure that the block of text for each page, each facing page, it must end on the same row. So when you go on to the next page, the text must end on the same row as the text on the previous page ended, and so forth. And that, ladies and gents, is the lengthy and detailed analysis of the interior design of the book. If you did enjoy this video, do please give it a thumbs up, and do subscribe and click on the notification bell for new videos that do come up. And for any inquiries, or if you'd like to contact us, you can send us an email to info@independentpublishing.co.za. And don't forget to also follow us on our social media platforms on Facebook and on Instagram at Mbilo Publishing. Now that's it from me. Thank you so much for your time, and I shall see you on the next video. Bye now.